Hi. So, if you're watching this, you probably already know what The Magicians is, but just on the off chance you don't, here's a quick summary. The Magicians is both a contemporary fantasy adventure series of novels by Lev Grossman and a contemporary fantasy drama television series adapted by sci fi. There are three books, hence the word trilogy, and 5 seasons of the show. But both versions are about modern day magicians, their lives, and an idyllic magical world called Fillory. Or so they say. But if you're like me, you've seen the show but haven't seen the books, or seen the books? What the hell? Here you go. Video over. Or, based on a few comments I've seen online, you've read the books but you haven't seen the show. So, this video is for you in betweeners out there trying to figure out if you should jump into the other end of the pool. This isn't a review, so I'm going to try to keep things as spoiler free as possible and hopefully relatively quick. And I'm assuming that more people have seen the show than have read the books, so I'm going to be attacking everything here from that angle, comparing what the books do differently from the show. But obviously, it works the other way around too, just backwards. Anyways, first and foremost, there's a bit of a vibe difference between the show and the books. The books have their funny moments, but overall, I would say they're less comedic than the show is. The books are also a little less, I don't want to say erotic, but do you get what I mean? There's a lot of conversations in the show, vagina logs between characters, not so much in the books. Don't get me wrong, though, the book definitely still has those adult themes. They're just a bit less present than in the show. I think the show was using them more as a marketing tactic, especially in the beginning. But a bit more seriously, and more importantly, there's also a difference in how the books treat magic itself. The books have this idea that you are a magician and that is difficult, but you do it because you have the will to do it. Whereas the show is a little bit more, you have magic, you learned how to do it, go do magic now, you got it. For some characters more so than others, yes, I have seen season 5, but the first book, The Magicians, spends a significant amount of time at Brakebills just going over magical, learny stuff. It is a little bit slow paced for my taste, but it does do a really good job of showing and emphasizing how much repetition and practice and study that these characters need to go through just to become semi competent magicians. Magic in the books is also just way more impressive, probably for budgetary reasons. But for example, if you've seen the show and you remember a line about a character being literally able to fly to the moon, yeah, that's not as much of a brag in the books. That's all I'm going to say. Of course, that's not to say characters in the books don't have any problems because their magic is better. Obviously, they have problems, but that's part of why I call the books fantasy adventure novels and the show a fantasy drama. Because in the books, there's just a lot more spectacle and power to magic, generally speaking. And even more so than in the show, in the books, different characters have different goals and ideals for what magic is, what it can be, what it should do, which makes for some really interesting characterizations by the end of the trilogy. Some characters just treat magic like a tool and they don't really think twice about it. But for other characters, magic is the end all be all goal. I think this works particularly well as another avenue of showing us Quentin's personality and his internal struggles. That's because, as a book, we get Quentin's internal monologue. Obviously, wouldn't make for great TV, I get that. Raise your hand if you want to see Quentin magic depressively. But I guess we've all kind of already done that, haven't we? But speaking of Quentin's perspective, it is unsurprisingly a lot of the books. I don't think the show gets more than 2 or 3 episodes before it starts devoting significant portions of screen time to non Quentin characters. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a single non Quentin scene in the entire first book. There might be one or two that I'm just forgetting because they're so small, but the point remains. Whether that's a good or bad thing kind of depends on your tolerance for Quentin as a character. Personally, I didn't mind at all. But I do use the word tolerance here intentionally because Quentin Coldwater's head is not a good place to be, especially early on in his story. Seriously, if you are a woman in book one, Quentin will think about your boobs. Which is all just to say the books are very much Quentin's story with occasional smaller detours to other characters, compared to the show, who explores most of its characters relatively equally at one point or another. But speaking of characters, there are quite a few differences. How many differences, you might ask? A little bit interruptive, if you ask me. Seriously, who's got the whiteboard here? That's right. You thought I didn't have any props, but I do. Here's how we're going to do. There are a lot of characters, particularly in the show, so to keep this relatively light and spoiler free, like I said towards the top, I'm just going to be putting a score out of 10 next to each of these main characters. The closer their score is to 10, the closer the two iterations of the character are to one another. I'm also going to give some brief, vague, spoiler free reasonings for why I'm giving each score to each character. But by no means will these be comprehensive. Really, I'm just using these scores as a ballpark to try and let you know how well your favorite characters translate into the books. Starting off with Quentin, I gave him a 5 out of 10. So, Quentin's character and his story start out in similar places in both the books and the show, but his journeys are wildly different, and how he responds to events around him are also pretty significantly different. Julia gets a 4 out of 10. Kind of the same story as Quentin here. Julia has a relatively similar character in the beginning, but how she reacts to events and where she ends up are really different between the book and the show. Julia is also the second most important character in the books in terms of page time allotted to her, right after Quentin. I don't think anybody else even really comes close, to be honest. Alice gets a 9 out of 10. Alice as a character is very similar between the books and the show. There are some differences, but they're a lot more subtle than other characters on this list. Penny gets a tentative 5 out of 10. The best way I can describe it is that Penny is recognizable in the books, but he's definitely very different. Some of his character traits are very similar, but others are very different. Same with his journey as a character. There are definitely similarities, but I would say overall the experiences are pretty different. I'm giving Elliot an 8 out of 10. Elliot is really similar between books and show. Again, the main difference is that he just doesn't get as much page time as other characters, so there's less time to flesh him out and develop him. But overall, I'd say really similar. Margot Janet gets a 7.9 out of 10. This is really only because her name is different. In the show, the character Margot is the character Janet in the books. Other than that, she's pretty much in the same boat as Elliot. Similar characters, but just not as much time to flesh her out. And while we're still talking about them, Janet and Elliot's relationship is a thing in the books, but again, because there's less time for development of their characters, there's also less time for development of that relationship. It's noted upon, but it's not really focused upon. I know a lot of people, including myself, really love Margot and Elliot's relationship in the show, so I just wanted to really emphasize it is in the books, it's just not as present. And that's because the characters aren't as present. It's mostly about Quentin and Julia, like I said, but you get the point. Josh gets a 7 out of 10. This one is kind of weird because I feel like Book Josh and Show Josh share a lot of the same narrative space, but their characters are actually relatively different. Katie gets a 0 out of 10, and that's because Katie is not in the books. There is a character in the books named Amanda Orloff, and Katie's last name is Orloff Diaz, but Amanda is not Katie. They're really not similar, they don't fulfill the same roles, and they're just not really comparable. Yeah, Katie is a show only character, which obviously means that Katie and Penny don't have a relationship in the books because Katie isn't in the books. Last but not least, Fen breaks my heart with a 1 out of 10. I'm mostly joking. I actually really like Book Fen. She's really cool, but she's just completely different from Show Fen. They're not similar at all, they just share a name. I do really like both versions, though. She's one of my favorite characters across the whole series. But yeah, just very different vibe. Now, obviously, there's a lot more characters than just these few, but like I said, I'm trying to keep this relatively short and as spoiler free as possible. This whole whiteboard segment was really just to give you an idea of how your favorite character stacks up between book and show. There are also several characters from the show, like Katie, that just aren't in the books at all. I did consider that to be more of a spoilery topic, so I'm not including that in this video. But if anyone has any specific questions about characters in the books, you can feel free to ask in the comments and I'll try to answer you guys there. If I do end up doing that, I'll mark my comments with a spoiler warning in them, so it'll be totally on you if you get spoiled. At some point, I might do longer form, full deep dive spoiler videos comparing the books and the show and how they branch off from one another, both in terms of plot and characters. Definitely not today, but it does sound fun, so I might give it a shot sometime. I also just really like talking about these characters and these plot lines. I really like them both a lot. I can't even really decide which is my favorite because the two are pretty different, even though they're generally about the same things. I just enjoy them both so much for different things that it's hard to pick one as a definitive winner over the other. Either way, if you're watching this, I definitely encourage you to read the books or watch the show if you haven't, because like I said, I think they're both great. This video was ideally just to help you get a little bit of an idea what you're going into and if it sounds like it's up your alley. If the only thing that gives you life in the show is the relationship between Margot and Elliot, you might not like the books as much. If you read the books and you wanted other characters to be explored a little bit deeper, well, the show has a lot to offer you. If you watched the show and wished it was a bit more spectacular and fantastical, the books definitely have a lot more of that for you as well. But yeah, like I said before, I think they're both great, just in slightly different ways. But seriously, Penny and Katie stands, do not seek comfort in the books. They will offer you none. I think I'm going to leave it on that appropriately depressing note. And if you think there's something I missed or misrepresented in this video comparing the books and the show, just know that I did do it specifically to spite you in particular. I hope this doesn't affect us going forward as friends. But anyway, that's all for me. Thanks. Bye.